I never thought I'd find myself here, lying on a cold surgical table with fluorescent lights burning into my retinas, the antiseptic smell clinging to the inside of my nostrils. 54 years on this earth, and this is where my love as a mother had led me. About to be cut open for a son who hadn't called me on my birthday for 3 years straight. Mrs. Patterson, I need you to count backward. From 10, the anesthesiologist said, his voice muffled behind his surgical mask. His eyes, the only visible part of his face, looked kind but detached. Just another Tuesday for him. Just another body. 10, 9, 8. My voice trembled despite my attempts to appear brave. The operating room swam before my eyes as nurses moved efficiently around me, checking monitors and preparing surgical instruments that would soon slice into my abdomen. 7, 6. Jamie's perfectly manicured hand had patted mine this morning when she dropped me off. "You're doing the right thing, Helen," she'd said with that smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Mark needs you. For once." The subtle dig hadn't escaped me. For once. As if I hadn't spent decades sacrificing everything for my boys. 5, 4. The double doors to the operating room suddenly burst open with a bang that made even the seasoned surgical team jump. Standing there, small and trembling in his wrinkled school uniform, was my 9-year-old grandson Logan, his face streaked with tears and something else. Determination. "Stop!" he shouted, his voice cracking. "Grandma, don't let them cut you. Do you want me to tell everyone the truth about why he needs it?" The surgeon froze, scalpel halfway to my exposed skin. The anesthesiologist's hand stilled over the syringe that would have sent me into unconsciousness. "Logan!" Dr. Mendoza's authoritative voice cut through the shocked silence. "You cannot be in here. This is a sterile environment." But Logan wouldn't budge. His small hand gripped an old, cracked cell. Phone like it was a lifeline. "They're lying to Grandma," he sobbed. "Mom's been making Dad sick on purpose. I have proof." The room spun, and not from the partial sedative already in my system. 3 months of doubt and guilt and fear crystallized in that moment. Jacob had been right all along. My younger son had warned me. "Something's not adding up, Mom. Mark's symptoms come and go too." Conveniently, I tried to sit up, the surgical tape pulling at my skin. "Let me hear what he has to say." Dr. Mendoza hesitated, then nodded to the anesthesiologist to hold off. The surgical team exchanged uncertain glances. Behind the observation window, I could see Jamie's face contort from concern to rage as she pounded on the glass. "Let him in," I said, my voice finding strength I didn't know. I still possessed. Logan ran to my side, his small hand slipping into mine. "I found Mom's secret pills," he whispered. "She puts them in Dad's food when he's not looking. Then she records stuff on her phone and sends it to Grandpa Lawrence." My mind raced back to Jamie's father, Lawrence Whitfield, a pharmaceutical executive with connections I never fully understood. The man who'd shown up at my modest Youngstown home 6 weeks ago with his equally polished wife, telling me that a real mother would never hesitate to save her son. "Play it," I told Logan, squeezing his hand. "Let everyone hear." Logan's fingers trembled as he pressed play on the phone. Jamie's unmistakable voice filled the operating room. "Phase 3 is working exactly as planned. His kidney function is down to 15%. The doctor is completely convinced it's autoimmune. Helen's a match just like we hoped. Once we have both kidneys, his failed one and her healthy one, we'll have the complete pathological progression documented. Lawrence says the Asian market will pay 8 figures for the research." The voice of Jamie's mother responded, "And Mark has no idea?" A laugh. Jamie's laugh. "Mark thinks he's dying. He's so drugged up half the time he can barely function. By the time he realizes what happened, the money will be in our offshore accounts and Helen will be recovering from surgery with 1 less kidney. Everyone wins." "Except Helen and Mark," Jamie's mother said with a disturbing chuckle. The recording ended. The operating room remained silent for what felt like an eternity. "I want to press charges," I said finally, my voice sounding distant even to my own ears. "And I want to see my son, my real son, not whatever they've turned him into." Dr. Mendoza immediately called for security. Through the observation window, I watched as 2 guards approached Jamie, whose perfect composure had shattered. She was screaming now, pointing at Logan, at me, at anyone who would listen. Sound was muffled through the glass, but her fury was clear. As they escorted Jamie away, I pulled Logan close. "How did you know, sweetheart? How did you figure it out?" Logan buried his face in my hospital gown. "I saw Mom crushing pills in the blender before making Dad's smoothies. Then one night I heard her talking on the phone about test subjects and kidney failure. I took her old phone from the drawer where she keeps stuff she thinks I don't know about. At 9 years old, my grandson had seen through what I, with all my years of life experience, had missed. I had been so consumed by guilt that Jamie had masterfully cultivated, that I'd ignored every warning sign. "Mrs. Patterson," Dr. Mendoza said gently, "we need to run toxicology tests on your son immediately. And the police will need that recording." I nodded, still trying to process everything. "Can I go see Mark now?" "Let's get you changed first," he said, helping me sit up fully. "And Mrs. Patterson, I've been a surgeon for 25 years. I've seen family dynamics of every kind, but this..." He shook his head. "You raised a remarkable grandson." As I was wheeled out of the operating room, still groggy from the partial sedative, I caught sight of Jacob rushing through the hospital corridor, his work boots leaving dirt marks on the polished floor. He'd left his garage mid-shift when Logan had called him. "Mom!" he called out, relief washing over his face. "Thank God!" I reached for his hand as they rolled me past. "You were right," I told him. "About everything." Jacob fell into step beside the gurney, his hand gripping mine. "Logan called me from school, said he was going to stop the surgery no matter what. Kid stole $20 from his teacher's purse for the cab fare." Despite everything, I laughed, a small broken sound that somehow contained both horror at what had nearly happened and profound relief at what had been prevented. "We're going to get Mark help," I promised. Real help. As we rounded the corner toward the recovery area, I saw Jamie being escorted toward the hospital exit by security and 2 police officers. Our eyes met across the corridor. The mask of the perfect daughter-in-law had completely crumbled, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. Something that had been there all along, hiding behind terms of endearment and concern. "You'll regret this," she mouthed at me. But looking at Logan's brave face and Jacob's protective stance, I knew I wouldn't. The only thing I regretted was not trusting my instincts sooner. It had started 6 months ago with what seemed like ordinary fatigue. Mark, my firstborn, had always been robust, the construction foreman who could outwork men half his age. When he began coming home exhausted, Jamie had been the picture of wifely concern. "He's pushing himself too hard," she told me during one of her rare visits to my small home on the east side of Youngstown. "You know how Mark is, Helen, always trying to prove himself." I had nodded, remembering how Mark had been that way since childhood, always the one volunteering to help neighbors with heavy lifting, always the last to admit when he was hurting. But there had been something in Jamie's voice, a note of calculation that I dismissed at the time. The fatigue had progressed to nausea, then to alarming weight loss. Mark's once solid frame had begun to shrink beneath his work clothes. When he finally collapsed at a job site 3 months ago, the hospital tests revealed the shocking diagnosis. His kidneys were failing. An aggressive autoimmune disorder, the specialists had called it, puzzled by its rapid onset. "We need to test family members," Dr. Mendoza had said gravely. "The waiting list for kidney donations is long, and Mark's condition is deteriorating quickly." Jamie had immediately turned to me. "You'll get tested, won't you, Helen? You're his mother." There had been an expectation in her voice. No, more than that. A certainty that I couldn't refuse. And why would I? This was my son. Jacob had volunteered too, of course. "I'll get tested first thing tomorrow," he'd said, already rolling up his sleeve as if they could take his blood right there in the hospital corridor. But Jamie had been strangely dismissive of his offer. "Mark and Jacob have different blood types," she'd explained with a tight smile. "We already checked his medical records. Helen is more likely to be compatible." I remember being surprised that she knew so much about blood types and compatibility, but then again, Jamie had always been thorough. A former pharmaceutical sales rep before she'd retired to be a full-time mother to Logan, she had connections throughout the medical community. When the results came back positive, I was indeed a match. Jamie's reaction had been oddly triumphant. "See? A mother's gift," she'd said, squeezing my hand too tightly. "Mark always said you two had a special connection." The irony wasn't lost on me. Mark and I hadn't had a special connection in years, not since he'd married Jamie and gradually pulled away from his working-class roots. The construction company he worked for might have been blue-collar, but his lifestyle with Jamie had become decidedly upper-middle class. The house in the suburbs, the luxury SUV, the private school for Logan. It wasn't that I resented their success. I was proud of Mark for building a good life, but Jamie had always seemed embarrassed by me. By my modest home with its dated furniture, by my lifetime job at the textile factory, by my simple ways of speaking and dressing. She'd carefully limited my role in Logan's life to occasional supervised visits, until Mark's illness had forced her to rely on me for childcare. That was when I'd started noticing things. "Grandma, why does Mom lock the medicine cabinet?" Logan had asked one afternoon as we baked cookies together. "To keep you safe, honey," I'd replied automatically. "Medicine can be dangerous if you take the wrong kind." Logan had frowned, his 9-year-old face scrunched in concentration. "But she takes stuff out and doesn't take it herself. She puts it in Dad's smoothies when he's not looking." I'd dismissed it then as a child's imagination or misunderstanding. Jamie was probably adding protein powder or supplements to help Mark regain his strength. That's what I told myself. But other things began to nag at me. Mark's symptoms seemed to wax and wane in strange patterns. He would seem almost recovered one day, then bedridden the next. And these fluctuations often coincided with Jamie's attentiveness, or lack thereof. "He had a good day yesterday," Jacob observed during one of our hospital visits when Mark was sleeping. "Jamie wasn't here much, was she?" "She had some meeting with her father," I remembered saying. "Something about a foundation they're starting." Jacob had given me a long look. "Doesn't it seem odd to you that Mark gets better when Jamie's not hovering over him with her special home remedies?" I had shushed him then. "Don't start with conspiracy theories. She's his wife, for goodness sake." But the seed of doubt had been planted. I began paying closer attention. I noticed how Jamie controlled Mark's medication schedule, insisting on administering everything herself, how she kept meticulous notes on his symptoms in a locked journal, how she would step out of the room to take calls from her father, returning with a composed smile that never quite reached her eyes. And then there was the pressure, the relentless pressure on me, to donate my kidney. "Mark doesn't have time to wait for the transplant list," Jamie would say, her voice breaking at just the right moments. "He needs you, Helen. Only you can save him now." When I'd expressed concern about the risks at my age, 54 wasn't young for major surgery, Jamie had brought in reinforcements. Her parents had shown up at my door one Sunday afternoon, Lawrence in his tailored suit and Caroline in her designer dress, looking out of place on my shabby porch. "Helen," Lawrence had said, not bothering with pleasantries, "Jamie tells me you're hesitating about the transplant." "I'm just being cautious," I'd replied, uncomfortable with his intimidating presence in my small living room. "The doctors said there are risks." "The only real risk," Caroline had interrupted, "is letting your son die because you're too selfish to help him." Her smile had been venomous. What kind of mother does that? That night, after they'd left, I'd called Jacob in tears. "They made me feel like I'm killing him by asking questions," I'd sobbed. "Am I a terrible mother for being scared?" Jacob's voice had been firm. "You're a great mother, and you have every right to ask questions. In fact, I think we need to ask a lot more of them. This whole situation stinks, Mom." But in the end, guilt had won out. I'd signed the consent forms. I'd prepared for the surgery. I'd lain on that table, ready to give part of myself to save my son, until Logan had burst in with the truth that would change everything. Now, sitting beside Mark's hospital bed as the toxicology results came back positive for a cocktail of drugs known to induce kidney damage, I watched my son begin to emerge from his chemical haze. The doctors had started him on treatments to flush the toxins from his system, and already there was more color in his cheeks. "Mom," he mumbled, his eyes focusing on me for the first time in weeks. "What happened? Where's Jamie?" I took his hand, unsure how to tell him that the woman he loved had been slowly poisoning him for profit, that the mother of his child had been using him as a human lab rat. "Jamie's with the police," I said gently. "Mark, there's something you need to know." His eyes widened as I explained what Logan had discovered. At first he shook his head in denial, but as the details accumulated, the recorded conversation, the positive toxicology report, the pills found hidden in their home, his disbelief turned to horror, then to a grief so profound it hurt to witness. "Logan," he whispered. "Is Logan okay?" "He's with Jacob," I assured him. "He's safe. He's the one who saved you, Mark. He saved us both." Mark turned his face away, but not before I saw the tears. "I pushed you away for years," he said, his voice breaking. "For her. And you still came when she told you I needed a kidney." I squeezed his hand. "That's what mothers do, son." As night fell over the hospital, I watched Mark drift into a natural sleep for the first time in months. The road ahead would be long. Legal proceedings against Jamie and her parents, Mark's recovery, Logan's emotional healing. But at least we would walk it together as a family. And for me, the kidney I'd nearly lost was still where it belonged. Sometimes love meant sacrifice, but sometimes it meant having the strength to question what was being asked of you, even when it came wrapped in the language of devotion. Logan had taught me that. At 9 years old, he'd shown more wisdom than I had at 54. Outside the hospital window, the lights of Youngstown glowed in the distance. The city, like us, had weathered hard times, but it endured, and so would we. The following week passed in a blur of police interviews, doctor consultations, and tear-filled conversations. Mark remained in the hospital, his body slowly healing from months of systematic poisoning. The doctors were cautiously optimistic that with proper treatment, his kidneys would recover without the need for a transplant. Each day brought small improvements: a better appetite, clearer thinking, longer periods of alertness. I divided my time between the hospital and my home, where Logan now stayed temporarily. Jacob had taken family leave from the auto shop where he worked, converting my small spare bedroom into a space for his nephew. He slept on my couch, unwilling to leave either of us alone. "You don't have to babysit me," I told him one evening as we sat on my porch, watching Logan ride his bike up and down the cracked sidewalk. "I'm not," Jacob replied, his eyes tracking his nephew's movements. "I'm making up for lost time. I should have pushed harder when I first suspected something was wrong." I patted his hand. "We all missed it, Jake. Even Mark. But you almost—" His voice caught. "Mom, you were literally on the operating table." The memory still sent chills through me. The cold surgical steel, the bright lights, the scalpel poised above my skin. How close I'd come to being another victim in Jamie's elaborate scheme. Logan pedaled over and hopped off his bike, his cheeks flushed with exertion. At 9, he was tall for his age, with Mark's build but my hazel eyes. "Can we visit Dad today?" he asked, hopeful. I made him a card in art class. Jacob ruffled his hair. "Sure thing, buddy. Go wash up and we'll head over." As Logan raced inside, Jacob turned to me. "How do you think Mark's holding up?" "Really?" I sighed. "He's heartbroken, betrayed, humiliated, but mostly, he's worried about Logan." Mark had been shattered by the revelation of Jamie's betrayal. The woman he'd loved, the mother of his child, had systematically poisoned him for financial gain. The detectives had explained how Jamie's father's pharmaceutical company had been developing a drug to treat certain kidney conditions. They needed documented cases of kidney failure and recovery to complete their research. Research they planned to sell to overseas markets where regulations were looser. Mark was to be their star case study. A healthy man whose kidney function declined at a documented rate, followed by a transplant, and then recovery with their experimental treatment. The failed kidney and my healthy one would provide the perfect before and after comparison. My son had been nothing more than a human lab rat to them. The district attorney called this morning, I told Jacob. They've charged Jamie and both her parents. Lawrence had apparently done this before, funded off-the-books human trials through shell companies. Jacob shook his head in disgust. "What about custody? Has Mark decided what to do?" This was the question that kept me awake at night. Jamie was Logan's mother. Despite everything she'd done, the thought of that little boy being caught in a vicious custody battle made my stomach churn. "He's talking to a lawyer tomorrow," I replied. But honestly, I think he's still in shock. Making long-term plans isn't easy when your whole world's been upended. When we arrived at the hospital that afternoon, we found Mark sitting up in bed, scrolling through his phone with a troubled expression. "Dad?" Logan ran to him, thrusting forward a homemade card decorated with what appeared to be a superhero wearing a hospital gown. "I made this for you. It's you, but with super strength." Mark's face softened as he pulled his son into a careful hug. "This is amazing, buddy. Thank you." While Logan chattered about school and his bike rides, I noticed Mark continuing to glance at his phone. When Logan went with Jacob to get snacks from the cafeteria, I settled into the chair beside the bed. "What is it?" I asked. Mark hesitated, then handed me his phone. On the screen was a text message from an unknown number. "If you pursue charges, I'll make sure everyone knows what a failure you are as a father. Logan deserves better than a man who couldn't even protect himself. Drop the case or prepare for war." "Jamie," I breathed, anger surging through me. "She's threatening you?" "Her lawyer must have gotten her phone privileges back," Mark said wearily. "This is just the beginning, Mom. She'll drag me through the mud, use Logan as a pawn." "No," I interrupted firmly. "She's the one who committed a crime. You're the victim here, Mark." He laughed bitterly. You think that matters? Jamie comes from money. Her father has connections. They'll paint me as an incompetent father, maybe even suggest I was in on it. And Logan, his voice broke. What will this do to him? I took his hand, noticing how the IV needle had left small bruises on his skin. Logan is stronger than you think. He's the one who saved you. Saved us both. He knew right from wrong when the adults around him didn't. Mark squeezed my hand. I've made so many mistakes, Mom. I pulled away from you and Jacob because Jamie made me feel like you weren't good enough, like your lives were embarrassing. Tears filled his eyes. I was so wrong. It hurt to hear him say it out loud, though I'd felt it for years. The gradual distancing, the canceled dinners, the way he'd flinched when I'd shown up at his company picnic in my factory work clothes. But now wasn't the time for those wounds. We all make mistakes, I said gently. What matters is what we do next. When Jacob and Logan returned with armfuls of snacks, the conversation shifted to lighter topics. Logan demonstrated a magic trick he'd learned at school, and Jacob shared gossip about old friends from the neighborhood. For a brief moment, it felt like we were whole again, a family finding its way back to each other through the darkest of circumstances. As visiting hours ended, Mark asked Logan to wait outside with Jacob so we could talk privately. Mom, he said, his voice low and serious, I need to ask you something important. I sat down, bracing myself. Anything. If it comes down to it, if there's a custody battle, would you help me with Logan? Not just occasionally, but really. Help? He trusts you. And I'm going to need time to get back on my feet. The request brought tears to my eyes. For years, Jamie had limited my role in Logan's life, controlling when and how I could see him. Now my son was asking me to help raise him. Of course I will, I promised. You know I'd do anything for that boy. For both of you. Mark nodded, relief washing over his face. Thank you. I don't deserve it after how I've treated you, but stop, I interrupted. We're family. Real family. Not the kind that poisons each other for profit. The words came out sharper than I'd intended, but Mark actually smiled. Yeah, he agreed. The real kind. As we left the hospital that evening, Logan's small hand in mine, I felt a strange mixture of grief and hope. The path ahead would be difficult, but we would walk it together. Not as the broken, disconnected family we'd become, but as the family we were choosing to be now. Grandma, Logan said as we reached the car, is Dad going to be okay? I looked down at his worried face, so young to have witnessed such betrayal. Yes, sweetheart, your dad is going to be just fine. And so are you, because we have you, he said with the simple certainty of a child. My heart swelled. And because we have each other. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in early October. The courthouse, an imposing limestone building in downtown Youngstown, loomed against a sky heavy with rain clouds as Jacob, Mark, and I climbed the steps. Logan was at school. We'd all agreed that the courtroom was no place for him, though. His recorded evidence would be crucial to the case. You ready for this? Jacob asked, steadying Mark as he navigated the steps. Though much improved, my older son still tired easily, his body working overtime to flush out the last of the toxins. Mark nodded grimly. As I'll ever be. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with muted conversation. The case had attracted attention, not just because of the shocking nature of the charges, but because of Lawrence Whitfield's prominence in the pharmaceutical industry. Local reporters scribbled in notepads while a sketch artist captured the scene from the front row. Our lawyer, Diane Morales, met us at the defense table. A former prosecutor with a reputation for toughness, she had taken our case at a reduced rate after hearing the details. They're bringing them in now, she murmured, gathering her files. Remember what we discussed. No outbursts, no matter what their attorneys claim. The side door opened, and 3 figures entered with their legal team. Jamie, Lawrence, and Caroline Whitfield. Jamie's usual polished appearance had given way to a more subdued look. Minimal makeup, hair pulled back, a modest navy dress. The transformation wasn't lost on me. She was already playing to the jury that would eventually hear the case, portraying herself as a respectable young mother, not the calculating woman who had systematically poisoned her husband. Our eyes met across the courtroom. Where I expected to see hatred or defiance, I saw something more disturbing. Calculation. Even now, she was strategizing, weighing angles, considering leverage. It sent a chill through me. The proceedings began with the formal reading of charges: attempted murder, conspiracy, illegal drug testing, fraud, and more. Jamie and her parents pleaded not guilty to all counts. The prosecutor, a stern woman named Rita Jacobs, laid out the state's case. Your Honor, what we have here is not just a family betrayal, but a calculated criminal enterprise. The evidence will show that the defendants deliberately induced kidney failure in Mark Patterson, planning to harvest both his damaged kidney and his mother's healthy one for pharmaceutical research worth millions on international markets. Jamie's attorney, a sleek man in an expensive suit, countered with unexpected viciousness. The state's case rests on the testimony of a child and a bitter mother-in-law. Mrs. Patterson had been estranged from her son for years, resentful of his success and his marriage. The alleged poisoning was simply Mrs. Whitfield administering prescribed medications to her husband, who has a documented history of kidney problems. I felt Mark stiffen beside me. His documented history had been fabricated by Jamie and her father through their medical connections. The judge called for the presentation of evidence. First came the toxicology reports confirming the presence of specific compounds known to damage kidney function in Mark's blood and tissue samples. Then the pills found hidden in Jamie and Mark's home matched to those compounds. Financial records showing large transfers between Lawrence's shell companies and offshore accounts linked to Jamie. And finally, the recordings. Both the one Logan had discovered on Jamie's old phone and additional ones the police had recovered during their investigation. The courtroom fell silent as Jamie's voice filled the air. We need to increase the dosage. His kidney function is still at 20%, and we need it below 15 to justify emergency measures. My mother-in-law is getting cold feet about the surgery. Lawrence's voice responded, just remind her that she owes him. Use the guilt. It's worked so far. And if that doesn't do it, I'll have Caroline pay her another visit. That woman wilts under pressure. I closed my eyes, remembering how effectively they had manipulated me. How close I had come to giving my kidney based on a deliberate, cruel lie. When the recordings finished, the judge called a brief recess. In the hallway, Mark leaned against the wall, breathing heavily. You okay? I asked, worried about the strain this was putting on his still recovering body. I just can't believe I never suspected, he said. All those times she insisted on making my protein shakes, checking my medication. I thought she was taking care of me. Jacob put a hand on his shoulder. She was a professional liar, Mark. She fooled everyone. Not everyone, I thought. Not Logan. Not Jacob, who had questioned things from the start. But I kept silent, not wanting to deepen Mark's pain. When we returned to the courtroom, the atmosphere had shifted. Jamie's confident facade had cracked slightly. Lawrence looked ashen. Only Caroline maintained her imperious posture, as if the damning evidence we'd just heard hadn't shattered their defense. The final blow came when the prosecution played a video from the hospital security cameras, footage of Logan bursting into the operating room, stopping the surgery seconds before it began. Seeing it from this perspective was surreal. The small boy in his school uniform, clutching the phone, his face streaked with tears, but his voice steady as he declared, "They're lying to Grandma." In the footage, Jamie could be seen behind the observation window, her expression transforming from concern to rage as she realized what was happening. The camera captured her pounding on the glass, then turning to flee as hospital security approached. When the video ended, there wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom, except for those of the defendants. The judge cleared his throat. Based on the evidence presented, I find sufficient cause to proceed to trial. The defendants will remain in custody. Bail denied due to flight risk and the severity of the charges. As the court officers moved to escort Jamie and her parents out, Jamie suddenly lunged toward our table. "This is your fault," she hissed at me, her composed mask falling away. Completely. "You turned my son against me." The officers restrained her quickly, but not before I stood to face her. "No, Jamie," I said quietly. "You did that yourself when you decided your bank account was worth more than your family." In the corridor afterward, reporters swarmed around us, shouting questions. Diane shielded us, guiding us toward the exit. "No comments today," she repeated, firmly. "The family is focusing on healing." We escaped to Jacob's truck, parked in a side lot away from the media circus. The rain had started, drumming on the roof as we sat in silence, processing what had just occurred. "What happens now?" Mark finally asked. Diane turned from the front seat. "Now we prepare for trial. It could be months, and it won't be easy. They'll attack your character, your parenting, anything they can. But with the evidence we have, especially those recordings, I'm confident we'll secure convictions." "And Logan?" Mark pressed. "Will he have to testify?" "We're working to avoid that," Diane assured him. "The recordings and his initial statement may be enough." As we drove away from the courthouse, I watched raindrops chase each other down the window, creating, meandering paths across the glass. It struck me as an apt metaphor for how we'd arrived at this moment. A series of choices and chances, flowing together in ways we couldn't have predicted. "I need to pick up Logan from school," Mark said suddenly. "I want to be the one to tell him how it went." Jacob nodded, changing direction toward Westside Elementary. We waited in the car as Mark walked slowly to the entrance, still moving carefully, his body a testament to what he'd endured. When the final bell rang, children streamed out into the rain. Logan emerged, scanning the crowd of waiting parents until he spotted his father. The boy's face lit up, and he ran full tilt into Mark's waiting arms. Through the rain-streaked window, I watched my son lift his child, holding him tight despite his weakened state. I couldn't hear their words, but I could see Logan nodding seriously as Mark spoke, then burying his face in his father's shoulder. Some wounds would take longer to heal than others, but watching them together, I felt a certainty settle over me like a warm blanket. We would survive this. Not just survive, but rebuild something stronger from the wreckage of betrayal. "Look at that," Jacob murmured beside me. "That's what it's all about, isn't it?" I nodded, tears mixing with raindrops on my face. "Family," I said. "The real kind." November arrived with bitter winds and the first dustings of snow across Youngstown. The trial date was set for February, still months away, but our lives had begun to find a new rhythm. Mark had been discharged from the hospital 3 weeks after. Logan's intervention, his kidney function slowly improving as his body healed from Jamie's systematic poisoning. He had moved in with me temporarily. His suburban house with its polished marble countertops and designer furniture held too many painful memories. Logan had Jacob's old room, decorated now with superhero posters and a bookshelf overflowing with science books. Mark took the pull-out sofa in my living room, insisting I keep my own bedroom, despite my offers to switch. "This is your home, Mom," he'd said firmly. "You've given up enough." It wasn't ideal. My small 2-bedroom house was cramped with 3 people, but there was something healing about the arrangement. In the evenings, we'd gather around my scratched oak dining table for meals I prepared, Logan chattering about school, Mark gradually becoming more engaged, more present than he had been in years. "Remember when we used to do this every night?" Mark asked one evening as we cleared the dishes together. "Back when Dad was still with us?" I nodded, smiling at the memory. "You and Jacob would fight over the last dinner roll like it was the Super Bowl trophy. Jacob always won," Mark chuckled. "He was scrappy." "He still is," I said, glancing toward the living room where Jacob had fallen asleep in the armchair, a sports magazine open on his lap. Though he had his own apartment across town, he spent most evenings with us, reluctant to leave his brother and nephew alone with their wounds still so fresh. "I've been thinking," Mark said, lowering his voice. "Once all this is over, once Jamie and her parents are convicted, Logan and I should find our own place. Somewhere close by, not back in that house. A fresh start." I felt a twinge in my chest at the thought of the empty rooms, the quiet that would settle over my home again. I'd grown accustomed to Logan's morning chatter, to Mark's coffee brewing before dawn, to the sounds of life that had been missing for so long. "Of course," I said, keeping my voice steady. "That makes sense. But you know you're welcome here as long as you need." Mark squeezed my shoulder. "I know, Mom, but you deserve your space back, and we need to learn how to be a family again. Just Logan and me." That night, as I lay in bed listening to the familiar creaks of my old house settling, I thought about how strange life could be. For years, I had longed for Mark to return to the family fold, to bridge the distance that Jamie had so carefully cultivated. Now he was here, under my roof, but only because of a betrayal so profound it had nearly cost both our lives. "Grandma, are you awake?" Logan's small voice came from my doorway. He stood in the shadows, clutching a worn stuffed dog he'd had since infancy. "What is it, sweetheart?" I sat up, turning on my bedside lamp. "I had a bad dream." He hesitated, shifting from one foot to the other. "About Mom." I patted the space beside me, and he climbed onto the bed, his small body still warm with sleep. "Want to tell me about it?" Logan stared at his hands. "She was giving Dad the bad medicine again, but this time I couldn't stop her. Nobody believed me. My heart ached for this child who had borne witness to such calculated cruelty, who had found the courage that adults around him had lacked. But you did stop her, Logan. You saved your dad. You saved me too. What if she comes back?" he whispered. What if she gets out of jail? I wrapped an arm around his thin shoulders. The police have lots of evidence. She's going to be in jail for a very long time. But she's still my mom. His voice broke on the last word, and I pulled him closer. Yes, she is, I said carefully. And it's okay to have complicated feelings about that. Dad says I might have to talk to a judge. Only if it's absolutely necessary, I assured him. And if you do, your dad and I will be right there with you. Logan nodded, his eyes heavy with returning sleep. Grandma, I'm glad we live here now, even if Dad snores on the couch. I smiled, tucking the blanket around him. Me too, sweetheart. After Logan had drifted back to sleep, I remained awake, watching the shadows play across the ceiling. In the quiet darkness, I allowed myself to feel the anger I kept carefully controlled during daylight hours. Anger at Jamie for poisoning my son, for manipulating me, but most of all, for the trauma she had inflicted on Logan. A child should never have to be the one to expose a parent's crimes. The next morning, I found Mark at the kitchen table, staring into a cup of coffee gone cold. The dark circles under his eyes suggested he hadn't slept much either. Logan had a nightmare, I said, pouring myself a cup. Mark nodded. I know. I heard him go to your room. I thought about joining you, but he trailed off, his gaze distant. I'm still not sure how to help him through this. You're doing the best you can, I assured him. We all are. I've been thinking about what happens next, Mark said. After the trial, after the divorce is final, Logan's going to need stability. And therapy, I added gently. Mark winced but nodded. Yeah, probably me too. He looked up, his eyes troubled. Mom, what if I can't give him what he needs? What if I'm too damaged by all this? I sat beside him, covering his hand with mine. Mark, do you remember when your father died? You were 14, Jacob was 11. I was terrified I couldn't raise you boys alone. I had no idea what I was doing. You did great, he said automatically. I did my best, I corrected him. I made plenty of mistakes. But I loved you both enough to keep trying, to keep showing up even when it was hard. I squeezed his hand. That's all Logan needs from you. To know that you'll keep showing up, no matter what. Mark's eyes filled with tears. I've wasted so many years, Mom. Letting Jamie pull me away from you and Jacob, buying into her idea that you weren't good enough for us. That's in the past now, I said firmly. We can't change it, but we can do better going forward. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of Logan's feet thundering down the stairs. He burst into the kitchen, fully dressed for school, despite it being only 6:30 a.m. Dad, Grandma, I figured it out, he announced, his face alight with excitement. Figured what out, buddy? Mark asked, quickly wiping his eyes. My science project. Logan pulled a crumpled paper from his backpack. I'm going to do it on kidney function. I can explain how the bad medicine hurt yours and how they fixed it and everything. Mark and I exchanged alarmed glances. The last thing Logan needed was to make his trauma the focus of a school project. That's certainly interesting, Mark said carefully. But maybe something less personal would be better? Like volcanoes or solar energy? Logan's face fell. But I already know all about kidneys now. And Mrs. Peterson said we should pick something we're experts on. I knelt to his level. Logan, what happened with your dad's kidneys is still very private. The trial hasn't happened yet, and it might confuse your classmates. Plus, Mark added, sometimes when something scary happens to us, it helps to focus on other things for a while. Things that make us happy. Logan considered this. Like what? What about astronomy? I suggested. You've been reading those space books nonstop. Logan's eyes lit up again. I could build a model of the solar system, with all the planets and their moons. As he raced back upstairs to retrieve his space books, Mark let out a long breath. Crisis? Averted. For now. There will be more, I warned. This isn't something he can just put behind him. I know. Mark ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so like his father's it made my heart ache. One day at a time, right? Isn't that what they say? I nodded, reaching for the coffee pot to refill our mugs. One day at a time. And that became our mantra in the weeks that followed. Through the pretrial motions, the meetings with lawyers, the days when Logan would come home from school silent and withdrawn after a classmate had asked about his mother, the nights when Mark would pace the living room, unable to sleep. One day at a time, we rebuilt our lives. Mark started working part-time at Jacob's auto shop, learning the business from the ground up while his body continued to heal. Logan joined the science club at school, finding solace in the predictable laws of physics and astronomy. and I, to my own surprise, began to emerge from the role of background support to rediscover my own interests. I joined a community garden, volunteered at the library, reconnected with old friends from the textile plant. Slowly, the wounds began to heal. Not completely, perhaps never completely, but enough that we could begin to look toward the future instead of being trapped in the trauma of the past. One evening in early December, as snow fell gently outside the windows, I found Mark sitting on the back porch, bundled against the cold. I joined him, wrapping my old cardigan tighter around my shoulders. "Cold night to be stargazing," I observed, following his gaze to the clear patch of sky, visible between snow clouds. "I was just thinking," he said softly, "about how close I came to never seeing another winter. How close you came to—" He couldn't finish the sentence. I took his hand, but here we are, still standing. Mark nodded, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "Still standing. Thanks to Logan. Thanks to you." We sat in companionable silence, watching the snow transform the world into something clean and new, and I felt a peace I hadn't known in years, the peace of family found again, of truth revealed, of a future uncertain but faced together. January brought a heavy snowfall that blanketed Youngstown in white. The trial date loomed closer, bringing with it a renewed surge of anxiety. Mark had been called for a deposition, recounting the months of his illness in excruciating detail. Logan's recorded testimony had been taken in a special session designed to minimize his trauma. A child psychologist present, no direct confrontation with Jamie or her parents. I had given my own deposition the week before Christmas, describing how Jamie had manipulated me into agreeing to the transplant. The defense attorney had been ruthless, suggesting I had harbored resentment toward my daughter-in-law, that I had misinterpreted her actions out of spite. "Mrs. Patterson," he had asked, his voice dripping with false concern, "isn't it true that you disapproved of your son's marriage from the beginning? That you felt Jamie wasn't good enough for your family?" I had met his gaze steadily. "No. I welcomed Jamie into our family. What I disapproved of was how she isolated Mark from us, how she made him feel ashamed of where he came from, and later, how she poisoned him for profit." The attorney had tried to rattle me for hours, but I had held firm. The truth was on my side. Now, on a frigid Tuesday morning, I sat at my kitchen table reviewing the notes Diane had prepared for my testimony at the actual trial, scheduled to begin the following week. "Stick to the facts," she had emphasized during our last meeting. "The recordings speak for themselves. Don't let them bait you into emotional outbursts." The doorbell rang, startling me from my thoughts. Through the frosted glass, I could make out the silhouette of a woman I didn't recognize. Cautiously, I opened the door. "Helen Patterson?" The woman was in her 40s, smartly dressed in a charcoal pantsuit despite the snow. "My name is Vanessa Morrow. I'm a reporter with the Tribune. I was hoping we could talk about the Whitfield case." My heart sank. The media had been circling for months, hungry for details about what they were calling the poisoned inheritance story. I had declined all interviews on Diane's advice. "I'm sorry, Ms. Morrow. I can't comment on an ongoing case." She nodded, unsurprised. "I understand. But I'm not here about the criminal charges, Mrs. Patterson. I'm here about the pattern." "Pattern?" I frowned, my hand still on the door. "Lawrence Whitfield has done this before." She pulled a folder from her briefcase. 3 times that I can document. Different companies, different drugs, but the same MO, human test subjects, falsified medical records, offshore accounts. The victims were always vulnerable in some way. Family members with financial problems, immigrants without documentation, people who could be controlled. I stared at her, the implications sinking in. "You're saying Mark wasn't the first?" "Not by a long shot." Vanessa's eyes were grim. "But he might be the first to get justice. The others were paid off, threatened, or simply disappeared. Your grandson's bravery has opened a door that Lawrence has been keeping shut for decades." I hesitated, torn between the need to protect my family and the growing realization that this might be bigger than us. "I should call our lawyer before we talk further." Vanessa nodded. "Of course. I'll leave my card. And Mrs. Patterson, what your family has endured is horrific, but you might have the chance to prevent it from happening to anyone else." After she left, I sat on the porch steps despite the cold, her words echoing in my mind. The idea that other families had suffered as we had, perhaps without the miracle of a brave child to save them, was almost too painful to contemplate. When Mark returned from physical therapy that afternoon, I showed him Vanessa's card and relayed our conversation. He listened in silence, his face growing more troubled with each word. "Do you think she's telling the truth?" he finally asked. "About other victims?" "I don't know," I admitted. "But if she is, don't we have a responsibility to find out?" Mark paced the living room, the limp from his prolonged illness still evident in his gait. "If there are others, their testimony could strengthen the case against Lawrence, maybe even lead to federal charges." He stopped, his expression hardening. "But it would also mean more publicity, more scrutiny on Logan." "I know," I sighed, understanding his conflicted feelings all too well. "It's a lot to ask of him, of all of us." "Let me talk to Diane first," Mark decided. "See what she thinks from a legal perspective." Diane's reaction was cautious but intrigued. She arranged a meeting with Vanessa at her office the following day, where the reporter laid out her evidence: a trail of suspicious clinical trials, unexplained deaths, and silenced witnesses stretching back 15 years. The pharmaceutical division of Whitfield Industries has been developing drugs for rare conditions where the approval process is accelerated and less stringent, Vanessa explained. "The profit margins are enormous if you can get to market first. Lawrence found a shortcut: create the conditions, document the treatment, rush to approval." "And Jamie?" I asked, thinking of my daughter-in-law's calculated cruelty. How deep was she involved? From what I can gather, she was her father's protege. Started working on these projects right out of college. Vanessa's voice softened. "Mrs. Patterson, I know this is difficult to hear, but Jamie may have targeted your son specifically because of you." "Me?" I blinked in confusion. "Why?" "Your medical records showed a strong genetic compatibility with Mark. That made you the ideal donor for their study." Vanessa hesitated. "And your economic situation made you vulnerable? A widow working at a factory, living paycheck to paycheck. They assumed you'd be easy to manipulate, easy to silence if things went wrong." The realization hit me like a physical blow. Our entire family had been selected like lab rats. Mark for his health, me for my compatibility, even Logan for what they assumed would be a child's malleability. The calculated nature of it made me physically ill. Diane placed a steadying hand on my arm. "Helen, you don't have to make any decisions today. Think about what this might mean for your family." But as we left the office, I already knew what I had to do. The Whitfields had targeted us because they thought we were weak. A fragmented family with a working-class mother too powerless to fight back. They had underestimated us once. I wouldn't let them do it again. Home that evening, I called a family meeting. Mark, Jacob, and even Logan, who sat cross-legged on the floor, solemnly aware of the gravity of our discussion. "There are other families," I explained, keeping my voice gentle for Logan's sake. "People who were hurt like we were, but who haven't been able to speak up." "Like when the bad guys have more than one victim in my comics?" Logan asked, his perception cutting straight to the heart of the matter as usual. "Exactly like that," Jacob said, ruffling his nephew's hair. "And when that happens, sometimes it takes all the victims working together to bring the bad guys to justice." Mark looked troubled. "But what would that mean for us? For Logan?" I met my grandson's eyes, seeing in them a wisdom beyond his years. "It would mean telling our story, not just to the judge and jury, but maybe to other people too. It would be hard and sometimes scary. But it might help those other people?" Logan asked. I nodded. "It might. And it might make sure that Jamie's parents can't hurt anyone else." Logan was quiet for a long moment, petting the stuffed dog he still carried when upset. Finally, he looked up with that determined expression I'd come to recognize, the one he'd worn when he burst into the operating room. "I think we should help them," he said simply. "That's what heroes do." Mark's eyes filled with tears as he pulled his son into a fierce hug. Over Logan's head, he met my gaze and nodded once. The decision made, we worked with Diane to connect with the prosecutor and the FBI, who had been building a case against Lawrence. Whitfield for years, but had never had enough evidence to bring charges. Vanessa's investigative work, combined with our testimony and the recordings Logan had discovered, provided the missing pieces they needed. By the time our trial date arrived in early February, it had transformed from a local case of attempted murder to a federal investigation into medical fraud, illegal human testing, and conspiracy. Lawrence and Caroline Whitfield were facing additional charges that could put them away for decades. Jamie, offered a plea deal in exchange for testimony against her parents, had refused, maintaining her innocence despite the overwhelming evidence. The morning of the trial dawned clear and brutally cold. I stood in my kitchen, carefully buttoning the blue blouse I had purchased. Especially for this day, In the mirror, I barely recognized the woman staring back at me, not because of any physical change, but because of the quiet resolve in her eyes. 6 months ago, I had been a mother desperately trying to save her son, willing to sacrifice a part of myself without question. Today, I was a witness for justice, clear-eyed and unafraid. Ready, Mom? Mark appeared in the doorway, dressed in a suit that hung slightly loose on his still-recovering frame. As I'll ever be, I replied, taking one last look in the mirror before turning away. In the living room, Logan waited with Jacob, his small hand engulfed in his uncle's larger one. He wore his school uniform despite it being a day off, his hair carefully combed, his expression solemn. "You look nice, Grandma," he said, offering a shy smile. "So do you, sweetheart." I knelt to straighten his collar. "Remember what we talked about? You don't have to watch if it gets scary. Uncle Jacob will take you outside." Logan nodded. "I know, but I want to be there. For the other kids whose parents got hurt." My heart swelled with pride and grief, pride at his courage, grief that he had to be courageous so young. I pulled him close, breathing in the scent of his shampoo and the faint trace of the maple syrup from his breakfast. "Let's go," Mark said quietly. "The lawyers want us there early." As we stepped outside into the crisp morning air, I noticed our neighbors watching from their porches and windows. News of the case had spread throughout Youngstown, transforming us from an ordinary family into reluctant symbols of both tragedy and resilience. Mrs. Abernathy, who had lived next door for 20 years, raised her hand in a silent salute. Mr. Guzman from across the street nodded solemnly. Jacob helped us into his truck, and we drove through the familiar streets toward the courthouse. I watched the city pass by. The shuttered steel mills, the struggling businesses, the stubborn signs of life and renewal. Youngstown had been knocked down repeatedly, but always found a way to rise again. Perhaps there was a lesson in that for us. "We're going to be okay, aren't we?" Logan asked as the courthouse came into view, its imposing facade looming against the winter sky. I took his hand, feeling its small warmth in mine. "Yes, sweetheart. No matter what happens in there today, we're going to be okay, because we have each other." And as we climbed the steps toward whatever awaited us inside, I held on to that promise like a lifeline. The truth was finally going to be heard, not just for us, but for all those who had been silenced before. That, I realized, was its own kind of victory, one that no one, not even the Whitfields with all their money and power, could take away from us. The courtroom fell silent as I approached the witness stand. Every pair of eyes followed my progress, from the stern-faced judge to the attentive jury, from the cluster of reporters in the back to the 3 defendants at the defense table. Jamie sat between her parents, her once perfect appearance now diminished by months in custody. She wouldn't meet my gaze. As I settled into the hard wooden chair, I caught Logan's eye in the gallery where he sat between Mark and Jacob. He gave me a small thumbs up, and I drew strength from his simple courage. "Mrs. Patterson," the prosecutor began, "please tell the court about your relationship with the defendants." For the next hour, I recounted everything. How Jamie had gradually isolated Mark from his family, how his mysterious illness had progressed, how the pressure to donate my kidney had mounted. I described the manipulation, the guilt trips, the carefully orchestrated visits from Lawrence and Caroline. "And what made you finally suspicious?" the prosecutor asked. "My younger son Jacob noticed that Mark seemed to improve when Jamie wasn't around, and my grandson Logan mentioned seeing Jamie put something in Mark's food." I paused, remembering those early warning signs we'd dismissed, but I wanted so badly to believe she was taking care of him that I ignored the red flags. When they played Logan's recording, Jamie's cold voice filled the courtroom. "Once we have both kidneys, his failed one and her healthy one, we'll have the complete pathological progression documented. Lawrence says the Asian market will pay 8 figures for the research." A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. One juror put her hand to her mouth. I focused on my breathing, refusing to look at Jamie or her parents. The defense attorney's cross-examination was brutal. He suggested I had misunderstood Jamie's intentions, that I resented her influence over Mark, that Logan had been coached to make the recording. "Mrs. Patterson, isn't it true that you never approved of your son's marriage?" he asked, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "I welcomed Jamie into our family," I replied steadily. "What I didn't welcome was watching my son's health deteriorate while being manipulated into dangerous surgery." "But you agreed to the surgery," he pressed, eagerly, according to several witnesses. "I agreed because I believed my son would die." "Without it," I corrected him. "Any mother would have done the same." He changed tactics. "Mrs. Patterson, have you ever been treated for mental health issues, depression, Paranoia? The prosecutor objected immediately. The judge sustained it, but the implication hung in the air that I was unstable, imagining conspiracies, unable to accept my son's illness. Mrs. Patterson, the defense attorney, continued, undeterred. How do you respond to medical records showing your son had kidney problems dating back 3 years before his marriage? My heart skipped a beat. This was the first I'd heard of such records. That's not possible. Mark was always healthy. The attorney triumphantly presented documents showing screening tests and preliminary diagnoses, all dated before Jamie entered the picture. Nothing further, he said with a smug smile, returning to his seat. During the recess that followed, Diane huddled with us in a small conference room. Those records are forgeries, she assured us. We have Mark's actual medical history from his previous doctor. The timeline doesn't match. But the jury doesn't know that, Mark said, his face pale with stress. They will, Diane promised. When the FBI agent testifies about the pattern of falsified medical records across all of Lawrence's cases. When court resumed, I watched from the gallery as a parade of witnesses took the stand. The toxicologist who had identified the kidney-damaging compounds in Mark's system, the hospital staff who had witnessed Logan's dramatic intervention, the FBI agent who outlined Lawrence's history of illegal pharmaceutical trials. Most devastating were the other victims, 3 families who had suffered similar experiences with the Whitfields, a young woman whose brother had died after mysterious liver failure, an elderly couple whose son-in-law had been left with permanent brain damage, a middle-aged man whose wife had nearly lost her life to unexplained heart problems. Each story followed the same pattern. A family member develops symptoms, another family member is pressured to donate an organ, and Lawrence's experimental treatments are positioned as the only hope. In each case, large sums had changed hands, and Lawrence's pharmaceutical companies had gained valuable research data. On the 3rd day of testimony, the defense called their star witness, Dr. Nathan Cole, a renowned transplant specialist who had reviewed Mark's case. In my professional opinion, he stated confidently, Mr. Patterson's kidney failure was consistent with autoimmune disease. The progression was typical, if somewhat accelerated. And could the compounds found in his system have been part of a legitimate treatment protocol? The defense attorney asked. Absolutely, Dr. Cole nodded. Experimental perhaps, but not unheard of for aggressive cases. I felt my heart sink. Dr. Cole's credentials were impeccable. The jury seemed impressed by his certainty. But during cross-examination, the prosecutor was ready. Dr. Cole, what is your relationship with Lawrence Whitfield? The doctor shifted uncomfortably. We've collaborated on research. Isn't it true that your research center has received over $3 million in grants from Whitfield Industries? That's a matter of public record, yes. And isn't it also true that you hold patents together on 2 pharmaceutical compounds? Dr. Cole's composed facade cracked slightly. Yes, but that has no bearing on my medical opinion. One last question, doctor. Have you reviewed the toxicology reports showing levels of compound WF-290 in Mr. Patterson's system? A compound that, according to FDA records, you and Mr. Whitfield patented specifically for inducing temporary kidney dysfunction in laboratory animals? The courtroom erupted in murmurs. The judge called for order. Dr. Cole's face had gone ashen. I was not aware that compound was found in the patient, he stammered. No further questions, the prosecutor said quietly. That evening, back at my house, we gathered in the living room, emotionally drained but cautiously hopeful. The prosecution's case was strong, strengthened by the pattern of similar cases and the damning evidence against Dr. Cole. Do you think they'll go to jail? Logan asked, curled up beside Mark on the sofa. I think so, buddy, Mark answered, his arm around his son's shoulders. The jury seems convinced. What about Mom? Logan's voice was smaller now. Despite everything, he still struggled with the reality of his mother's crimes. Mark hesitated. She made very bad choices, Logan. And yes, she'll probably go to jail too. Logan nodded solemnly. I know she did bad things, but sometimes I still miss her. His admission hung in the air, heavy with the complicated grief only a child could feel for a parent who had betrayed them. That's okay, I said gently. It's okay to miss the good parts of her. Were there good parts? He asked, his eyes searching mine. I thought carefully before answering. She gave us you. That was the best thing she ever did. Logan seemed satisfied with that. He leaned against his father, his eyelids growing heavy. Within minutes, he was asleep, the stress of the day taking its toll. Jacob, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, finally spoke. Whatever the verdict, It won't undo what they tried to do. It won't erase the last 6 months. No, I agreed, but it might prevent it from happening to someone else. Mark gently adjusted Logan in his arms. I keep thinking about what you said in your testimony, Mom, about how any mother would have done what you did, agreed to donate your kidney to save your child. His voice caught. Jamie is Logan's mother, but she was willing to let me die, to use both of us as lab rats. I had no answer for that. Some betrayals went beyond understanding. As the fire in the hearth burned low and night settled over the house, we sat together in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. Tomorrow would bring closing arguments. The day after, perhaps a verdict. But tonight, in this moment of quiet before the final reckoning, there was a fragile peace in simply being together, still standing despite everything that had tried to break us. The jury deliberated for just 6 hours. We sat in the crowded courtroom, the tension palpable as the foreman handed the verdict sheet to the bailiff. My hand found Mark's on one side, Jacob's on the other. Logan sat between his father and uncle, unusually still. In the matter of the state versus Jamie Whitfield, on the count of attempted murder in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty. A collective exhale seemed to sweep through the room. I kept my eyes forward as the remaining verdicts were read. Guilty on all. Counts for Jamie, Lawrence, and Caroline. Conspiracy, fraud, illegal human experimentation, attempted murder. The list went on, each guilty, another brick in the wall between us and the people who had tried to destroy our family. Jamie's face remained impassive, but I caught the moment her mask slipped, a flicker of disbelief, then rage, quickly suppressed. Lawrence stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched. Caroline dabbed at dry eyes with a silk handkerchief, playing the role of devastated mother to the very end. The judge scheduled sentencing for the following month and adjourned the court. As we stood to leave, reporters converged at the courtroom doors, cameras flashing, questions overlapping in an unintelligible wave. Let's go out the side entrance, Diane suggested, guiding us through a back hallway. Outside, a light snow was falling, dusting the courthouse steps with white. Logan tilted his face up, catching snowflakes on his tongue, momentarily just a 9-year-old boy instead of a key witness in a landmark criminal case. It's over, Mark said quietly, watching his son. Really over. But we all knew it wasn't that simple. The convictions would bring justice, but not healing. That would take longer. In the weeks that followed, our lives slowly began to take on new shapes. The media attention gradually faded. Mark found a small house to rent on the west side of town, close enough that Logan could ride his bike to visit me on summer days. Jacob helped them move, building shelves and fixing the old wiring, making the place safe and sound for his brother and nephew. At the sentencing hearing in March, Jamie received 25 years in prison. Lawrence got 30, Caroline 18. The judge's words were damning. You preyed on the most sacred of human bonds, the love of family, for profit. Your crimes represent a betrayal, not just of your victims, but of human decency itself. I felt no triumph as they were led away in handcuffs, only a profound weariness and a quiet certainty that justice, however imperfect, had been served. Spring arrived with a gentleness that seemed to mock the harshness of the preceding months. The crocuses pushed through the soil in my front yard, purple and yellow heads nodding in the breeze. I spent more time in my garden that year than ever before, finding solace in the simple act of coaxing life from the earth. Logan joined me some afternoons after school, his nimble fingers planting seeds, asking endless questions about what would grow and when. His nightmares had become less frequent. The child psychologist he'd been seeing said he was resilient, that with continued support, he would be okay. On a warm Saturday in May, I arrived at Mark's new house for a backyard barbecue, a small housewarming celebration now that they were properly settled. Jacob was already there, manning the grill with exaggerated seriousness. A few neighbors had been invited, along with Logan's science teacher, who had become a source of stability during the tumultuous school year. "Grandma," Logan called, racing across the lawn to greet me. "Dad got the telescope set up. We can see Saturn's rings tonight if it stays clear." I hugged him close, noticing how he'd grown taller in just these few months. "That sounds wonderful, sweetheart." Mark approached more slowly, smiling. The limp was barely noticeable now, and color had returned to his face. He was working full-time at Jacob's shop, learning the business from the ground up. "Thanks for coming, Mom. And for the rhubarb pie. Logan's been talking about it all week." As the evening progressed, I found myself sitting on the back porch steps, watching my family. Jacob and Mark by the grill, laughing about something. Logan explaining the telescope to his science teacher with enthusiastic gestures. The scene was ordinary, mundane even, and all the more precious for it. Mark joined me on the steps, handing me a glass of lemonade. "Penny for your thoughts." "Just grateful," I said simply. "For this moment. For all of you." He nodded, understanding. "I got a letter from Jamie yesterday." My breath caught. What did she want? To apologize, supposedly. His voice was neutral, but I could sense the turmoil beneath. She claimed she was under her father's influence, that she never meant for it to go so far. "Do you believe her?" Mark shook his head. "No, but I'm going to let Logan read it when he's older. He deserves to hear her words, even if they're lies. He needs to make his own peace with who his mother is." We sat in silence for a moment, watching Logan demonstrate the proper telescope eyepiece to his teacher. "You know," Mark said finally, "all those years I spent pulling away from you and Jacob, trying to be something I wasn't. I thought I was moving up in the world, but I was just losing sight of what matters." "And what's that?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "This." He gestured to the yard, to the people gathered there. "Family. Not the kind you perform for social media or impress with fancy houses. The kind that shows up when you're falling apart. The kind that saves your life." As night fell, we gathered around Logan's telescope. One by one, we took turns looking at Saturn, its rings crisp and clear against the velvet sky. Logan's excitement was contagious, his knowledge impressive as he explained the planet's composition, its moons, its place in our solar system. Standing there under the stars with my family, damaged but healing, wounded but whole, I felt a sense of peace that had eluded me for months. The Whitfields had nearly destroyed us with their greed and calculation. They had seen us as weak, as disposable, but they had underestimated the strength of real family bonds, the courage of a child's honesty, the resilience of love that asks for nothing in return. Later, as I prepared to leave, Logan hugged me tightly. "Grandma, are you happy now?" he asked, his eyes so serious in the porch light. I thought about the question, its simplicity, its complexity. "Yes," I told him truthfully. "I am. Are you?" He considered this with the careful deliberation only children can give to such fundamental questions. "I'm sad sometimes about Mom, but mostly I'm happy. We're together, and that's what matters." Out of the mouths of babes, I thought, holding him close. As I drove home through the quiet streets of Youngstown, I reflected on our journey. 6 months ago, I had lain on an operating table, ready to sacrifice part of myself based on a lie. Today, I was whole, not just physically, but in deeper ways. I had reclaimed not just my kidney, but my family, my dignity, my sense of self. The truth had cost us dearly, but in the end, it had set us free.